Welcome to a very special episode of Gotta Run with Will. In fact, 3 episodes, which we've decided because the person we're talking to today is so important in the story of running that his story is really inseparable from the whole modern running movement, and that's George Hirsch. Welcome, George. Welcome to Gotta Run with Will. George is here, to put it in very simple terms, because he's the Emeritus Chair of the Board of the New York Roadrunners, because he's the former editor of Runner's World magazine and other important publications, and many other contributions. I am Roger Robinson, and I'm here because I own a very nice silver bowl, which I put fruit and ice cream in, and inside which is engraved New York City Marathon 1980 first. I know, and George knows, that it actually means first master over 40 on that occasion, but it doesn't say that, so I don't tell anybody. But I'm here because I own that trophy, which Will knows means my connection with the New York City Marathon goes back not as far as George's, but it does go back a long way. And since winning the Masters in 1980, I've set a Masters record at over 50. I've covered the race for television. I've covered the race for print journalism, for online journalism, and many other contributions to that race. So I do have a history with the New York City Marathon, which is an important part of George's history. Will Sanchez also invited me because I am a running historian. I'm a running historian. George is running history. So let's meet him. George, there was a Swiss-made documentary film a few years ago called Free to Run, which opened with a sequence, a long solo shot of you looking over Central Park and reminiscing about what running was like when you began in the 1960s. Can you recapture that for us, and let's just go back to before the running boom, what it was like in those very early days?
Yeah, I really can. There were not a lot of runners. That would be the very first thing I would tell you, completely different than today. And Central Park was not a big running mecca because, well, there weren't a lot of runners to begin with. And in that we were a relatively small group, mostly men, and we'd go out and just jump into the park and run. I remember you'd pretty much know everyone, if not by name, at least you'd recognize them, you'd wave to them. It was a very small, kind of a fringe group. You know, most people didn't even know what to make of us back then.
Well, let's go forward to 1969. And I choose that date because that's when I believe you first ran the Boston Marathon.
It was my first race.
And it was your first race.
Of any kind.
You were 34 years old. So there's a bit of a gap.
That's right.
You were born in 1934.
That's right, 34. Yeah.
And just to summarize, to save you having to go back over all this, you went to public schools in New Rochelle.
New Rochelle, yeah.
You went to Princeton, where you were magna cum laude, and you took an MBA at Harvard. So pretty distinguished university career. And you then served in the US Navy as an officer.
In Italy, Roger.
Italy.
I was home ported on an old LST, you know, those old World War II landing ships in Naples, Italy for 3 years. And I couldn't have been luckier.
Did you run in high school? Did you run in college? Did you run in the Navy? When did your running start?
Yeah, I did run in school. And I was the worst of all things, which was a slow quarter and half miler. No one knew what fast twitch fiber was back then, but I learned I didn't have it, and I didn't have enough knowledge or desire to move up in distance. So I just kept running slow quarter miles, and I wasn't any good at all.
So when did you actually start running in your, whatever, 30s?
Yeah. Yeah, so we launched New York Magazine in 1968, and like any startup, you're working all the time, weekends, and I was 34, as you say, and I realized I was getting out of shape. The belt needed an extra notch, that kind of thing. And the only thing I knew to do, because I had run some in the past, was to run again. And my idea of running then was to take one of those clunky stopwatches. I'd go outside my apartment house, I'd click it, I'd run around the block once, click it again, come upstairs and write the time, 3 minutes and 26 seconds, whatever, in my book. And then the next day I try to beat that time. And one day I met a runner, a whole different proposition than what I was doing. I was running as hard as I could for 3 minutes. He was, running, loping along, and we talked and met, and I started to run with him. We became friendly. We began running regularly. Vince Chiappetta, whom you know.
Is that who it was?
This is who it was.
Oh.
And we began to meet on purpose, and my pace way slowed down. I put aside that stopwatch, and he began telling me these stories. He was president of the New York Road Runners Club, and he was telling me about the Boston Marathon. Now, everyone heard of the Boston Marathon, but I never knew anyone who actually had run the Boston Marathon. It was all just beyond imagination. And started running with Vince, and I kept getting more and more inspired, and sometimes on weekends we'd take longer runs and longer runs. And April 1969, $2 entry fee, a letter from a doctor saying that you were fit enough to do this, and how my doctor knew, because I certainly had never come close to running 18 or 20 miles at that point. But I had this letter, which you had to submit for your entry. I went up. Vince was my mentor. I had then a few other friends who by then I knew, and they were giving me advice as well about this marathon. I had two friends from Sports Illustrated, and they wrote me a letter on going to the Boston Marathon, what I needed to know. They were editors. They were, in my opinion, experts, because they had run it once the year before. The race started back then at noon, and they told me what I should have for breakfast that morning. I will never forget it. It was a bagel, it was a bowl of oatmeal, a stack of pancakes, coffee, orange. It was as if someone had died of starvation on Heartbreak Hill. And this all passed for, running knowledge back in the day. And I ran it, and I got through it, and couldn't walk, as you can imagine. I wasn't really prepared for it. But an interesting story is the next night, I was at a dinner party in New York, and maybe 10 people were there. And during the conversation, someone said, "George ran the Boston Marathon yesterday." Everyone stopped. I mean, now, who doesn't, if you haven't run it yourself, who doesn't know people who run the marathon? But this was a conversation, more than I wanted it to be, and everyone's asking me questions, and I'm talking about running the marathon and all of it. And back then, there was a late night, very popular television talk show host named David Susskind, and he was at this party. And he said to me, "Do you have any friends who know how to talk, who ran the marathon yesterday? I'd love to do a show on this." So I got Vince Chiappetta, Andy Crichton, one of those Sports Illustrated editors, and Dr. George Sheehan, a cardiologist who was writing articles about running in his local newspaper. The four of us went on and did this whole show, which you know, as far as I know, it may have been the first ever show, you know, on television just dedicated to talking about running.
That's absolutely fascinating about with the link between your running and your media
Yeah,
world,
yeah.
your media network,
So
and so
interesting.
on.
Yeah.
That's the story of you meeting Vince is really significant because I interviewed Vince on Gotta Run
I
With
know you did.
Will
I know you did.
about whatever 4 or 5 years ago,
Yeah.
and he was so well informed about those very early days and
Yeah. Oh,
just
yeah.
you know what it took to create the New York road runners from out of what was it the Road Runners Association, American Road Runners Association,
Yeah.
New York Association is what it originally was.
He played a
And,
big role
and then
in
it became
all
the
of
New York
that.
Road Runners
Yeah.
Club. Oh, and then you encountered it there.
And later, I became the best man at his wedding when he got married. This
really?
is, gosh, no, it was like way back around then, you know, long time.
Well, I was going to ask you about some of the other personalities. You must also have met Ted Corbett.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, not just met, but known him well.
Not just met, knew him well. Ted was the person that we all looked up to. I mean, long before I came, way back in 1958, he was the first president of the New York Roadrunners. And he was an Olympic marathon runner. I mean, no one of us knew any Olympic runners, as you can imagine. And even as he was getting older and into his 50s, he was a fantastic, like you, he was a great age group runner and an extraordinary ultra marathon runner. He was just someone that you, because of his influence and his whole quiet demeanor, you couldn't help, you know, but look up to Ted. He was very, very influential.
I only met him once or twice towards the end of his life, and
he was a physical
clearly
therapist.
He
was his
he
career.
had a kind of gentle charisma, if I can use that.
Beautiful.
He was so low key, but so kind of quietly persistent and wise, and
Yeah.
so they're very interesting group of personalities. And I see now where you kind of fitted in those early days.
Yeah, I mean, he was there way before I came
You
along.
brought in the media dimension as well,
yes.
even as
But he
early
was
as
a
that.
physical therapist, and he was a very generous one. He, you know, when I had some hip problems, he worked on me any number of times, and yeah, he was a special man. And in terms of modern distance running, I mean, he's been referred to as the father of distance running, and,
Yes,
and
in
I
this
think
country.
that's really appropriate.
Okay, let's go forward.
Yeah.
Because then, you know, I've got you down, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, as running 40 marathons in all, and your best in 1979, so 10 years later, by this time you were 44,
Yeah, 44.
running at 2:38.
Yeah.
And my job is just to kind of create some context, because in those 10 years, you know, if you'd run 2:38 in Boston in 1969, you would have finished about 35th. When you ran it in 1979, you finished well outside 100.
Oh, so far
150,
back. Mid-pack,
something like that.
absolutely, yeah.
And I don't know if you were third master, but you certainly weren't first and second.
I
know
didn't.
who they were.
I wasn't third
Didn't even
or
put him
even
in the master.
10th. I mean, there were so many good runners. I was really not. Yep.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that you were part, and you were a good runner, but not a great one, not a front runner. But you were part of one of the most extraordinary movements in human history, really,
Yeah.
when this little eccentric sport, which you described so well at the beginning, when you know, there are only 5 or 6 guys running around the park, and you all knew each other, and you were doing ridiculous time trials around the block. You know, nobody knew anything. And suddenly, after not much more than 10 years, you've got fields of several thousand, and of a quality which isn't even matched now
Right.
in America. And it's
Right.
you know, if you take the first 100 at Boston or New York, you know, that fast, but 60 or 70 of them are foreigners. Whereas in those days, of the something, whatever it was, 150 who broke 2 hours 30, almost all of them were Americans.
Yeah.
90 of them were 90 out of 100 were Americans. So this is the running boom, and you were very much part of it. And in a way, your story is just so typical that you kept improving, but you kept falling further behind. If you see what I mean, because by this time you were 40, and so of course you're not 20 anymore. But there's all these 20-year-olds who are training 100 miles a week. For absolutely, people need to realize this: no monetary reward, whatever, absolutely nothing.
No monetary award for us. For us, it was just a hobby. It was something we did, but there was no monetary award for the elite runners.
No.
I'm talking about the Frank Shorters, the Olympic champions. We can get to it, but when we talk about the 1976 marathon, I negotiated with Frank Shorter and Bill Rogers, who were the two name runners we brought in, for some under-the-table payment to give each of them $2,000 because it was not legal because it was an amateur sport.
No,
so
I know too well.
Yeah,
I could not even be paid for writing journalism in those days because for writing journalism about running and it was people couldn't sell shoes or whatever else.
Exactly.
Yes, it was an interesting era, but through it and despite it came this enormous upsurge of enthusiasm and commitment and people discovering the sport and building it. And the other thing that needs to be said is that not only were the elite runners not being paid, but the people who would have been paying them were not being paid. Nobody was being paid for being chair,
that's right,
executive CEO of New York Road Runners or something.
That's right.
Everybody was volunteers.
It was.
I wouldn't want to put the date when people were first being paid, but it was certainly
I can't
in the
remember.
late 19th.
Well, the chair's never been paid. The board doesn't get paid, but the CEO, I mean, this is a huge organization, and you need people with real skills. I mean,
totally. I'm just trying to evoke for people now.
Absolutely, you need a real
the world,
top person.
the evolving world that you lived through and were a significant figure in because of your articulateness and your media contacts and the contributions you made also. When did you join the board of the New York Road Runners? You became chair in 2004.
Yeah, I was only maybe a year or two before that I joined the board, but I felt certainly when Fred Lebo was the head of it, and I was the worldwide publisher of Runner's World for so many of those years, I felt very close because Fred and I were good friends, and we literally talked every day, and running was a big part of our life experience. We traveled together. We went to races in Marrakesh and Rome and Tokyo, and we talked about things that bettered the sport, for sure. Absolutely. I think we both...
one of the great ideas, which I don't want to skip over because it's one of the most significant things of that era and that you were involved in, was the decision in 1976, the American bicentennial year, to move the New York City Marathon out of Central Park, which it was 4 laps of Central Park, and put it into the streets of the 5 boroughs, one of the most epoch-making decisions in the history of running.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Not the absolute first city marathon, because 1900 Paris Olympics was that, when they ran all through the streets of Paris and they all got lost. But pretty much the first marathon to have this vision of running through a whole city. And we heard Vince Chiappetta's account of this, and Gary Corbett has done wonderful work recording his father Ted's role in it. Tell us how you saw it, how it came about.
Yeah, well, Vince, whom you just mentioned, and Fred Lebo were the founders and race directors of that race in Central Park. And the 5 years that race existed, from 1970 to 75, that race was growing. And that was as the running boom was happening. And a big catalyst was in 72, when Frank Shorter won the Olympic marathon. The idea of an American guy with, a very attractive guy, winning the marathon, it was a very difficult Olympics. The Israeli massacre, it was a terrible Olympics for so many reasons. And that was, in many ways, a very bright spot in the Olympics. And it caught people's attention, this whole idea of an American winning the marathon, which wasn't thought of as a sport an American could win. And that jump-started this whole running boom for sure. So by 1976, the idea for a 5-borough marathon was put out there. For many years, I always subscribed to the idea, because I'd read it in articles and books, that the idea came from an interesting New York character. He was a runner named George Spitz. And George, he certainly did a lot to promote the marathon. Later, Gary Corbett, the son of Ted, came out with a letter that his father had written to George. They were friends, in which he was convinced that his dad had initially come up, and you know, origin ideas. And all those years when George was credited with it, George and Ted were both alive and were aware of all of that. But I will say this, and we touched on this, Ted Corbett was very modest. He was an incredibly humble person. He was not someone who was ever going to step forward and take credit for anything. And that idea had, you know, gone along, you know, origin story ideas of an idea. But once the idea was out there, George Spitz really began to champion it. And he was an interesting guy. He had worked in the city government, in the audit department. Sometimes he'd get laid off for good reasons, like, you know, better work conditions, and he was leading the charge. And then he'd work for the state and this kind of thing. And he was called a political gadfly. He wrote letters to the editors of newspapers. Sometimes they even got published. He ran for office, never cared about winning. I remember he was running for things like city council. I think he ran for mayor once. I remember once I said to him, George, here you are, you're running for office. You don't have any literature. You have no brochures, nothing. Why not? And he said, oh, they would just cause litter. But what he wanted to do was put out some ideas, like, you know, fast rail traffic. You know, I mean, he was a substantial thinker, and he was a really offbeat character. And he started calling people and saying, this idea of a marathon through the 5 boroughs, he was promoting it, that for sure. And he called Fred, and Fred was like, you know, gee, it's a big undertaking, and George, this could cost $15,000. Where are we going to get money like that? You know, this kind of thing. He'd call me frequently. Sometimes if the phone would ring at 1 in the morning, you know, I'd say to my wife, normally if your phone rings, you get nervous, but I'd say to my wife, must be George. And without any niceties or hellos about that idea, he might not have talked to you for 2 weeks. Now about that idea, and I remember he came down and he visited me, and I thought it was a big idea, so I never, you know, one that was kind of overwhelming, and I never got enthusiastic about it. But initially, he got a very prominent politician in New York, Percy Sutton, to warm up to the idea and finally embrace it. Percy was the Manhattan Borough president, and he was a bigger-than-life character, a guy with an incredible story. And Percy went to 2 of New York's biggest real estate developers, Jack and Lou Rudin, civic-minded. He got them to agree to put $25,000 up. And I was publishing a magazine called New Times at that time, and I agreed to put another $5,000 in, and all of a sudden something was beginning to happen. Percy asked Fred and me to go down to City Hall and meet with then the mayor, Abe Beame. And the whole pitch that we made to him was this 5-borough marathon should be in conjunction with the bicentennial celebration, the tall ships that were coming into New York. And this was a time the city was on the verge of bankruptcy. Crime was sky high. I mean, way higher than anything we've seen in recent years. It was a very, very tough time. And there was no discussion of year 2 or a long-term event. It was the bicentennial. The mayor agreed, and now Fred Lebo had his mission, and as you know, it became his life's work. And it turned out he was really born for this. He was so ideally suited to it. He was a Holocaust survivor. He'd been doing knockoffs in the Garment Center. He came to running to get fit to improve his tennis game. He never became a particularly fast runner, but he loved it. He loved the whole community and the sport of running and the people. And he really got active, as I said, in organizing. And by now he was the president of this New York Road Runners. And what he brought to it was he was an impresario. He was a promoter. He was media savvy. He was an organizer, and he had a vision. He had a big vision. And he just jumped on this idea and took off with it. And the timing was right. Running was really building in '76. And he knew what to do. And one of the first things he did was he knew he had to get the best known marathon runner then, Frank Shorter. He won the Olympics in '72. He was second in a questionable to a East German who later proved to be part of the East German doping, the state-sponsored doping system, but he was very well known by now. He was known beyond the sport. He was the first marathon runner that really became known as a big sports figure. And the other one was Bill Rogers, and he had set the American record. And Fred knew that if he could get them, the media would take real interest. And so he did. And yeah, I remember that very first press conference, very first and only press conference that we had. Fred asked Frank, who was then living in Colorado, to come in for this. And the day before, Fred called me and he said, the city's full, there's a big convention, and I can't get a hotel room for Frank. Can you help me? And I knew someone at the Plaza Hotel, and I called over and got him a room and called back, and Fred said, oh, no problem. A member can put him up at the New York AC. And I said, Fred, we're not putting Frank at the New York AC. Their policy back then were no Jews and no blacks. I said, he's staying at the Plaza. And Fred then wasn't this famous race director. He went out to the airport late that night, picked up Frank, and on the way in he told Frank this story about the New York AC. And Frank called me late that night when he got to the hotel, and he said, "Thank you." He said, I would not have wanted to stay at the New York AC. I'm really happy. Do you want to run with me in the morning on the way to the press conference? So we ran around Central Park, and the press conference, we didn't have money for coffee and bagels, was outside, just on right sort of where the finish area is on that little dirt path. And Frank was there. Mayor Beam came. Fred got what he wanted, which was some press attention. And that was some of the beginning of all of this.
And then what happened over the next few years, when that race continued on that course and just built, was that New York became the leader of the worldwide running boom.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that was what made the switch. It would be impossible to identify a particular leader before that. Boston maybe, England also, but that race caught the imagination so much, and then it went on and continued to with Frank and Billy, and then of course Greta coming in as well.
Of course.
And suddenly, I remember, I was in New Zealand, and people would talk about maybe running the Boston Marathon, maybe running the Poly Marathon in England or something like that. Suddenly everybody wanted to come to New York.
Suddenly every city wanted a marathon.
And every city wanted a marathon.
And they wanted advice from guess who? Fred.
Yes, from Fred.
And us. I mean, Fred and I went over and visited with Chris Brasher when he was starting the London Marathon.
Well, he came over and ran the New York Marathon. Yes.
There you go. And it became something that no self-respecting city, could live without a marathon. And look at the world today.
That's a fascinating story, getting right down to those personalities, Spitz, Sutton, Corbett, Chiappetti, Fred Lebo, and with you there.
And Percy Sutton. I can't tell you how significant he was. I mean, I already mentioned that he had the connections to call Jack and Lou the Rudens for the money. But, just to set up a meeting and to go to the city hall, he was someone who was going to be running for mayor himself. He was very well known in political circles. I think his role in this was game-changing.
And the other thing that was going on that people don't talk about so much is that New York Road Runners was becoming about more than just the marathon. Well, just is hardly the word, but the marathon was huge. But people, and this is where I think you deserve credit, were beginning to see that a running organization needed to do other things and to capture the imagination year-round. I'm leading to a question about something I've had from an unsourced information, that the person who created the now famous New Year's Eve midnight race was somebody called George Hirsch.
This is right. This is right.
Can you tell us that story quickly?
Yeah, it's really
quick. We're getting towards the end of time.
Sure. I had heard through Frank Shorter about the San Silvestre run down in Brazil, which isn't at midnight, but it's on New Year's Eve in the afternoon. And he had told me he had gone down and he had run it and he had won it. And that sort of prompted my thinking that New Yorkers, an awful lot, particularly runners, New Year's Eve never lived up to expectations. No New Yorkers wanted to go to Times Square, as you know. I mean, that didn't do it. And it was always this big build-up. And so I said to Fred, I want to start a race at the stroke of midnight. And my magazine, then the Runner magazine, prior to my doing Runner's World, will sponsor it, and I'll get a money sponsor. And I got the Brooks Shoe Company to be the initial sponsor. And I decided, like Fred, took a leaf from his book. I got Bill Rogers to run the first one, so we'd have some interest. By then he was 79, this was. So he was, I guess, I don't know, 3-time champion of New York, and he'd been winning Boston. He was the guy, period. And Bill ran the race, and that kicked that one off, and there was no looking back on that one either.
And I ran it in about 85 or something like that. And you had costumes. People could wear costumes. So I ran it as Fred Lebo.
Well, they started showing up in costumes on their own, so finally we did a costume judging contest.
Well, I didn't win that, nor did I win the race, because it was so cold that I pulled a calf muscle after about 800 meters. But I forgive you for starting that race, nevertheless. and on that dismal note, we're towards the end of our first installment. And George, I want to thank you not only for your time and eloquence here today, but also for the contribution which you clearly made as a major part of this just extraordinary social phenomenon of the running boom, which I believe is much more important socially, communally, than it's ever yet been recognized. It's not just a sport. It's something whose benefits go very deep, and we can explore that further in later installments. For the moment, let's just, again, thank George Hirsch for his time both in the past and today. Thank the Hatton Neighborhood Network for providing this service, and thank Will Sanchez for inviting us, and for the whole series of Gotta Run with Will. To be continued. Don't miss the next installment.